unmute, Ray.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm letting him in.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. I'm so
Yeah,
sorry for being late.
Oh,
If something isn't on my calendar, I just forget about it turns out.
No worries. So,
okay. So you're okay if we record the interview, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Cool. Sounds good. Let's put that.
all right. So, first, can you give us like a quick intro of yourself, like your name, your occupation, and how you got started with First in general?
Yes. So I am AJ Foster. I am mostly involved with First as a First technical advisor here in the Orlando League area in Florida. My day job is a software engineer for a company called Code Sandbox. We make developer tools for other developers to use while they're making their projects. And back in the day, I started with First Lego League, and it came out of just sort of chance that I had the opportunity to work with someone who was coaching in a First Lego League team, and kind of got me interested in engineering topics, like basics to engineering, the kinds of things that you can teach using Legos. I joined the team. I continued on and was able to find a school with a first robotics competition team. And through all of that, what I loved to do was be able to write a little bit of code and actually see something happen in the real world. And that really brought me into software engineering, becoming a programmer full time, and continuing to volunteer with First so that I could give back that experience to others.
That's great. Another thing I want to ask you, what like skills, it could be technical or soft skills, would you recommend to someone who's like entering this like job market, like software engineering or anything like that?
It's a tough market, and not necessarily in the ways people might expect, because technology changes so fast. So no matter what you learn in school, you can go to absolutely the best school with the most up-to-date programming curriculum out there, and it's still not going to last you all that long, because technology is going to move forward at a very rapid pace, and you have to stay up to date. So the most successful software engineers that I know are people who are very comfortable recognizing what they don't know and figuring out ways to teach themselves those topics. So it's a lot less about coming in with any particular knowledge or any particular skills, and more about being comfortable in situations where you don't have all the answers and figuring out ways to go out and find those answers on your own.
That's nice.
I think that's a really good point. I think as my experience in like First, because I'm the programmer for our team, so I've seen that. I think that applies to our first team as well. Because when, for example, making the auto, sometimes like, for example, last year our first auto was just very inconsistent, right? So we went to match and maybe it worked like twice out of 6 times. So we wanted to make it more consistent. So I had to go and find the resources for that and figure out how we can make it better. And just I think that's something that applies from First to the job market.
Yeah, because it's very rare in real circumstances too, like when you're on the job, just the same as when you're working on a team. It's very rare for you to know everything ahead of time. It's a dream when someone comes to me and says, we want to make this, and here's everything you need to know in order to do it. That almost never happens. So you have to be prepared to do that discovery along the way and make changes to your initial plan as you're going, because you're going to find new obstacles the moment you get started.
So, like, what are the most common hardware issues like you encounter during like the competition, and like how do you like troubleshoot?
Yeah, there's a few that just won't go away, unfortunately. I think a lot of them have to do with hardware that has been in use for a while. And this is true for plenty of things, but if you have an XT30 cable on your robot that you've been plugging in and plugging out of your control hub for, all season, multiple seasons probably, eventually it starts to wear down the pins inside. And it's just this constant, things on your robot that you interact with mostly. It's not so much things that other robots interact with or the way you're interacting with the field, but the parts that you touch, they see this wear and tear. And it's a stress that just builds up over time, and it causes tons of issues. Power issues are probably the most common on a robot. And I think I'm trying to tie that back to like things we've experienced in my job. The places that or the ways that people use the code that you write, the human interaction and the interface between those two things, over time, people will develop their own ways of using whatever you make. You can create just the most beautifully designed interface, and people are going to figure out a way to abuse it, or they're going to figure out a way to misuse it accidentally because they don't quite understand what's going on or it wasn't clear. Anywhere humans and technology are coming together, there's a seam. There has to be a seam, right? It can't be a seamless experience. And that's where all of the problems that I deal with every day, whether it's volunteering at first or working at my job, that's where they all appear.
You talked about how like XT30 cables and power issues are very common. We actually had a problem like this on our robot where we had a power issue where it kept disconnecting earlier this season, and we had to first unplug all of the power cables between the hubs, and then we figured out that it was an issue with the actual power switch. Is there a better recommended system to doing that? That's better, or is it just having to deal with the XT30s and just troubleshooting them at this point?
There is a way. It works. It's not right for everyone. I want to preface this. Trying to think if I have the props I need to show it off. But there are two different types to the XT30, the quote male and female ends. If you were looking at your control hub, this is a broken hub that I have for decorative purposes. So if you're looking at a control hub, you have one of these here that has little pins on the inside. And those are the ones that get smushed together, and the cable can just fall out because they're not providing any friction against the cable and they're not making good electrical contact. So as far as the hub goes, this one is the problem. This one is usually okay. Or if anything, if there is a problem with this other port, it's usually a problem with the cable that you're using, not the hub itself, because this part is pretty solid. So one of the things you can do is just use the other end of the cable. Like if you need a cable to go from a battery to this, probably your battery has an end on it that looks like this bottom one. I don't know whether that's called male or female in the normal parlance, so I can't tell you the correct term, but probably it looks like that. And so it has to be plugged into this top port just because that's what you have. But if you can find a way to plug it into this bottom port, you're going to have a lot less problems. So what you may need to do is take XT30 cables and cut them and make yourself a cable that is, I'll just say female to female, right? It has the same thing on both ends so that you can go from that battery cable that looks like this to this side of the port. That gets you a certain distance, right? Because you probably have an expansion hub as well, or you have something else that uses XT30 that you also need to plug in. So this is where the Rev power block, or there's one available from Studico now as well, that just gets you one XT30 in and many out to all your devices. You can do what I just said, but have a bunch of cables using basically the wrong end on one side to go to all of your devices. And then if you encounter the same problem in the future where the pins have collapsed and it's no longer making good electrical contact, you just replace the cable. You don't have to replace the hub or try to repair it somehow. That would be not, again, not right for everyone to do that, because you probably, if you're doing that, you probably need to be soldering some cables, and you might need to purchase some extra XT30 ends that you can put on your own cables. But if you have the resources and you have the know-how to do that, I recommend it. Just skip the problem altogether. Power expansion block, XT30 ends where the pins are in the cable, and then you don't have to worry anymore.
Yeah, thank you for those tips. They're definitely things that we will try to fix our problems when we have them. Also, looking at the other side of the thing with the driver station. So we still use Android phones to our driver station, and I know now most teams use the driver hub. But we have a driver hub, and when we used it, we found a couple. So first we saw like the battery drain was kind of fast, and also it froze a lot on us. So like when playing a program or something, it froze a lot. So are there any? So our phone works fine for the most part. It just we've been like people have recommended us to upgrade. Is there any like benefits then? How could we mitigate the problems that we've been having with the driver hub? And like, are they common?
It's a good question. So I'm not going to be able to find the rule fast enough to reference it, but I'm pretty sure if you go to ftc.game and look at the competition manual, and you look at the section specifically about the operator console, which includes the driver station device, I believe you are allowed to have a backup device handy. So if, for example, you decided that you wanted to try using the driver hub again, you could still have the Android device powered off there, ready to go if you encounter any problems. Now, there have been plenty of issues with that Rev driver hub, unfortunately, which, to be fair, it is a device that's used for one specific purpose, and it's gone through just one public iteration, so they haven't had really a chance to make it better and fix the problems, right? They've made some minor modifications, like including foam inside of the battery compartment for newer driver hubs that you ordered today, which is great. It solves some of the battery issues where the battery was moving around inside of the compartment. They've tried to make updates to the battery firmware to make that better, but there's still issues there, right? And it still freezes on you. The wireless still disconnects sometimes, and it's really frustrating. The best thing I can recommend is what you're already doing. Use an Android smartphone. But if you go that route, understand what you're giving up in the process, because depending on which phone you choose, you may be giving up on using 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi if the phone doesn't support it. So that can be probably the biggest detriment that you're going to experience. Now, these days, here in Florida at least, most teams use 5 gigahertz. So if you're the only team on 2.4 gigahertz, you're actually fine. You won't even notice. But in other areas, and especially other regions, there are a lot more teams that are still using Android phones on 2.4 gigahertz, and you can run into the classical problems of just Wi-Fi congestion when that happens.
Yeah, so we did upgrade to the Moto G4 phones a couple years ago, so we are on the 5 gigahertz channel. So that's
Nice.
And talking about all these problems with like the new like these control systems, I've heard talk about like the new control system coming in like the future years. Is it like do you know much about that, or do you know what it would entail?
Yeah. So, just kind of sharing what's already public, they had an announcement out saying that basically the winner of the request for proposals, there were a ton of companies that submitted proposals for what that control system should look like, but they announced the winner is a collaboration between Limelight and Raspberry Pi. And I think what that means is, if you look at the history of those two companies, you have Limelight, who's very focused on FIRST and trying to make some of the most difficult problems that FIRST has very easy to solve, especially when it comes to vision. Limelight focused on vision for a long time, and They've done a really good job there, and now they have an opportunity to bring that same ethos to the control system as a whole, which I think is really cool. And then you, on the other hand, you have Raspberry Pi in collaboration with them, a company that, you know, people have been frustrated in the past with their decisions regarding supply chain and who they offer units to, but they've always been extremely deliberate and extremely thoughtful with how they produce their technology and how they make it available to people. You know, I worry sometimes that people who have read that blog post and seen the words Raspberry Pi in there kind of worry like, well, you know, I remember a few years ago, I couldn't even buy a Raspberry Pi because of supply chain issues. That was actually a deliberate choice on their part to make sure that they had enough units set aside that they could give to companies in as small a quantity as possible so that the companies relying on their hardware didn't have to lay anyone off, as opposed to making them available on the open market for people like you and me to buy as consumers. Like, that level of thoughtfulness is exactly what I want to see in a supplier for a first control system, because that level of thoughtfulness will help us avoid, hopefully, some of the issues that we've seen in the past 2 years with just the ability to get hubs and other pieces of technology. So all of that to say, I'm really optimistic for what's coming. There are not many public details yet about what the control system actually looks like, but if you go back and read the original request for proposals, there's a lot of cool stuff in there. And technology has matured to a point right now where so many of the things that we want to do as teams, and they're just a little difficult to do, I have a feeling they're going to be very possible for us in a very short amount of time.
Thank you for your input. So something I want to ask is that given your experience being the Florida field tech advisor for some, like in the Orlando League, as you previously mentioned, what's like a common mistake, like a driver or technical mistake that teams make, and like how could you like avoid it?
I occasionally give a speech about stress, and I might have even given this to you last year, but it's worth repeating. You know, competitions are stressful, and they're stressful in two main ways. They're stressful on the people and they're stressful on the robots. And that stress manifests in different ways for both the people and the robots. When you as a human are stressed, you tend to forget things. You can get a little flustered, and the things that you are used to doing that are very habitual, that are very good habits, tend to slide away, and you're just kind of get this tunnel vision and you're focused on one objective. And that's where the human aspect can go wrong. The way that you fight that is with checklists. I see this with drive teams all the time. If you have a checklist and you're able to see point for point what it is you need to do and in what order, you're not going to forget it. And it doesn't matter how stressful the situation gets, whether you're playing your first match of the day or you are in the finals at the state championship. You'll still have the exact same checklist and you will remember the exact same things that you need to do in order to be correctly prepared for the match. So every team, especially every drive team, should have a checklist for what to do when they're getting ready for a match. And even what you do in the pit before you queue for the match, that deserves a checklist as well to make sure that you have everything charged up and ready to go and you're bringing everything that you need. So that's the human side of the stress. The robot side of the stress is some of the things that we've already talked about. You are putting your robot in a situation that it probably isn't in during practice, because most teams practice with one robot on the field because it's just your team. And you're driving around, you're probably not running into many things. You definitely don't have other robots running into you, especially not on purpose, not in a defensive way. So your robot is going to be encountering situations that it hasn't really encountered before, or at least not often. So it's really important to understand that all of the parts of your robot are going to be getting those forces acted on it. All of the wires are going to be hit and stretched in ways that they're not normally hit and stretched. Things like strain relieving the wires so that when a wire is tugged, if it gets entangled on something, or if another robot hits the side of your robot and it just stretches something out in a new way, the strain is going to a zip tie and not to the port that the wire is plugged into. Things like that are how you deal with the stress on the robot side. Put those two things together, and your consistency and your ability to score high in a match because you aren't encountering these random issues will shoot through the roof.
Thank you
So,
for your advice.
so other than like the field and team side of things, what's the most challenging part of being an FTA, and how do you overcome it?
Being an FTA is it's a weird role because on one hand, we can make it very simple and just say that the FTA's job is to be in charge of the field and make sure that the field is set up correctly, the field is working, nothing's broken, all the tape is in the correct spot, everything like that. So on one hand, we can make it really simple and say that. And if anyone is starting out as an FTA, or if anyone listening wants to act as an FTA assistant, like start there. And you can be extremely effective and extremely helpful to any tournament you attend by just focusing on that. On the other hand, there's so much more that you can do as an FTA because especially at our league level events, like league meets and league tournaments, there usually isn't a role that's referred to as a technical director. This is a role that you get at some of the larger events, especially the World Championship. And this individual is in charge of a lot of the other things that happen at a tournament, all of the audio and visual systems, making sure there's a screen where the audience can see the scores and everything like that. A lot of that falls to the FTA at these smaller events. And that's a duty that's shared with the event director and other people for sure. And, even here in Florida, whether it's the Space Coast League or Orlando League, we share those responsibilities across a lot of people. But it can be a lot. And that means there's a lot of opportunity if you're interested in those things. Like 2 years ago, I knew nothing about video switchers or live streaming. And that's an area that I was interested in. So I had the opportunity to get more into it and, really expand my knowledge into that area. But it can feel like a lot as you're doing it. So if anyone out there wants to be a technical volunteer, I just want to say you can focus on the small things, the most important things, making sure that anyone who has an issue at the field comes away from the field knowing what to do next. Like make little things like that your mantra. And then you can expand out into the things that actually, interest you if they interest you.
So to do that, what kind of training did you like get to become?
It's weird because I'm old, it turns out. And I've been incredibly lucky to have a number of other volunteers here in Florida who really have defined what the FTA role is, and I can just ask them questions. There is no better teacher than just going to an event saying, hey, I want to be a technical volunteer, whether that's starting as a field inspector, FTA assistant, whatever. I want to do that. And just seeing the problems that happen. And over time, you build up this mental toolbox of things where, I've seen a robot act like that before. So I have a pretty good idea of what the issue is. And over time, you develop that and you just get faster and faster at helping teams when they need help or diagnosing an issue or whatever it is. So I really want to say that the best thing you can do is just do it. You don't have to have any particular background or go through any certain training to get started. You can just show up on the day of an event and be an effective technical volunteer. If you are someone who pays attention, you like to observe things and kind of note, what you think might be going on or help a team walk through a problem, all of that is useful. And you really don't need anything ahead of time.
So, like a common issue that like I see among a lot of teams in our league is that, and like we've also had this problem too, So, like with wiring, like how can like teams improve like their cable management?
Your team has a long history, which is great. But with a long history comes a lot of old wires. So, one of the things increasingly I'm seeing teams run into is issues where you have either a servo cable or a sensor cable, for example, where part of the insulation on the cable has worn away, uh, and part of the cable, maybe it touches the frame of your robot and grounds out the signal or the power for a servo or something like that, causes control hubs to reset, everything like that. So, start, it's know your cables. Like actually inspect every inch of them before you put them on the robot. And then you won't have any surprises like that. And then as you're putting them on the robot, think carefully about how they're routed. And I don't just mean like thinking about which wires to bundle together. That can be helpful too, because you have these nice little bundles of wire and it's less spaghetti across your robot. But also things like what are the sharp edges that these wires have to go around? And how can I protect them from those sharp edges? What's going to happen over time as those wires rub back and forth because your robot's getting hit by another robot or whatever it is? And is it going to be a situation where it's going to rub away the insulation? Things like that are important things to consider. Beyond that, a lot of wire management, at least to me, feels more like an art. If you can arrange the wires in such a way that it looks good, that's actually kind of a good thing. Like, that's probably a good way to do it. It means that you're grouping wires together, probably by a purpose. You have nice, well defined channels where multiple wires are moving together. You don't have situations where you just have one wire hanging out on its own and it's going to get chopped by something or caught in gears. So, if you make it look good, that's actually probably a good way to do it.
And I think that's like we've been having to recently in recent years order new wires like that we've seen our old ones going bad, and watching where you put your wires I think is very important also because like for example last year I think it was the Wednesday before state tournament we were running like autonomous or something and our control hub just like went black. Like our expansion hub just went black. It stopped working. And once we plugged stuff in, like nothing worked. And then the next day we actually put in another one, and that one's like I think it blew also. So like this was a couple days before the state championship, so it was obviously a big problem. So what was actually the problem is that on the power switch, the like the plastic casing had come down, so the metal part of the power switch was contacting the robot. So it just like now we have electrical tape at all the possible points of contact on the robot, which has really helped us in with like consistency with the robot running and stuff.
Yeah, there's a period of time, especially right before competition or after you've made any major changes to your robot. If you are someone who works on the mechanical or electrical aspects of a robot, you really should just sit down, preferably in a relatively quiet space. Other people can be around, but when it's quiet, and just spend time with the robot and checking over everything. And this is really hard to do because it takes time and it feels like you're not being productive when you do it. But setting eyes on everything and really evaluating, like, is there too much stress on this wire? Is this going the right way? Do I need to add another zip tie to keep these in place? Stuff like that. It's most useful after you've made those major changes or right before you're going to compete. But it's just anytime you can, you need to sit down and do that.
In regards to, I want to talk about one more thing in regards to like powering modules. So we've seen the new Rev Servo Hub being released, and we actually were able to order one. We have our league championship in a couple of weeks, so we decided against implementing it like right now to avoid problems. But have you seen or have you been able to test the Servo Hub, or do you know how it functions? Because I know it's supposed to be an improvement on the SPM, which our team definitely has problems with in the past. So
Yeah, so I haven't gotten my hands on one yet. Um, hopefully someday I'll be able to, maybe come over to your pit and check it out. Um, I'm just looking at the product page for it. It looks great. One thing that I remember, and teams should just be generally aware of this. This isn't necessarily specific to the Rev Servo Hub, but Servo Hubs in general. Is teams need to be aware of what happens to the servo when it is given power versus given a signal. And what I really mean by this is, what does your servo do when you stop the program or initialize a new program and hit play? Because different servo hubs behave in different ways. And a common problem that you might run into, and something that teams had to pay specific attention to this year, is you can't move in between autonomous and teleop. So you need to really understand how the servo hub responds to the actions that you're taking when you initialize teleop, for example. And if your servos are shuttering in any way, then you need to not hit that button until the actual start of teleop. That's the main thing I want to caution people on, is not just the Rev Servo Hub, but any servo hub and any piece of electronics that you use on your robot. Really try to understand how it works and how it responds to different situations, especially the exceptional scenarios that you might encounter during a match.
And
Yeah.
adding on to Bart's question, how important do you think weight distribution is on a robot? And are there any like common designs that capture it?
If you search around, you can see some videos of robots falling off of the third rung. And that's not funny, because obviously teams have worked really hard on their robots and we don't want them to fall, but it's a perfect example of why weight distribution matters. And man, it sounds like I'm laughing at teams. I'm really not, but it's just such a perfect example of this, right? Even if you weren't hanging on something, even if you aren't on an FRC team this year that has to crawl onto that little cage-like thing, weight distribution matters in the sense that it's going to affect how you drive the entire match, and it's going to affect how you're able to interact with the components. I've seen so many robots tip over the years because they were, just this year it would have been to reach up and score something into one of the baskets, but everything was aligned so close to the edge of their robot that it only took just a little hit from someone else, something unexpected, to make them tip over. And it's a lot less common this year because this game doesn't really, force you to do that. Linear slides have gotten much better and much lighter, so you don't see a lot of that like you used to. But still, we design sometimes in CAD, sometimes in a nice, safe classroom where there's only one team present, but it has to perform in much wilder situations during matches with a lot more chaos on the field. And so the assumptions you make about how stable your robot is going to be, you should probably guard that against a few hits and bruises along the way.
Yeah, definitely. And we've actually had some problems with distribution this season that we've worked to fix and fine tune, because as well as the tipping, it does affect the driving a little bit. If you have a bad weight distribution, it can affect your strafing in some places and have you not strafe straight.
Especially if you want an accurate autonomous. If you have mechanism wheels and all of your weight is centered on one side of the robot, it's going to be really difficult to use encoders to get any sort of accuracy along the way.
Sandra, do you guys have any other questions?
Yeah, I actually want to ask something. So let's say a team has like it causes like field damage or anything. What's your protocol like as a FTA to diagnose that issue?
As an FTA, and specifically not a referee, I'm really not worried about penalizing the team or anything like that. I would rather that it didn't happen again. And sometimes referees can use fouls as or warnings as a good deterrent. But really, what I want to know and why I want to figure out which team caused the field damage is so that I can see if something's wrong with the robot, if the team is even aware that something is wrong, and if they know how to fix it or if they need support. Because it's not just about, you know, hey, don't do that. And even being an FTA, it's not even just about telling you what the problem is. I want you to have the resources to be able to fix it, especially with inspection, right? A lot of FTAs act as inspectors of either type. And your goal as an inspector is not to tell you that your robot is illegal. It's how can we help you get to a legal state? So that's what's mostly going through my mind is, can we identify which team damaged the field? Can we help them fix the problem so that it doesn't happen again?
So when you mean like when you help teams like fix their designs, what are some like standing out designs that you've seen or any common?
Unfortunately, I don't get to spend a lot of time really dealing with the core designs of the robots very often. I don't get enough times where I get to interact with teams like in a team meeting setting. It's always on competition day. So I really only get to see your robot while it's performing, which on one hand is good, right? I get to see the outcome of your work. What I don't get to see is all the trade-offs that you made along the way. Because, I mean, if you go to any competition, especially at this point in the season, since we're in a league model here in Florida, we get to sort of see robots develop over time. And we're getting to the end of the league season. So the robots are pretty much about as developed as they're going to be for the regular season of competition. And it's very different from the beginning, right? Meet one is a totally different story. And I like to see that story progress for teams, but I don't really get all the details of it. I happen to know, for example, there's a local team who really did the math and they figured out that hanging was not the thing to do. You could score so much more if you spent that same amount of time scoring, doing other things. That was true for them with their particular design of robots. So what you see in the end is a robot that does not focus on hanging. And it's not because they couldn't do it, it's because of a deliberate design choice. And this is the type of thing that teams really need to include in their engineering portfolio because it's just not obvious. Even me, as a volunteer who occasionally gets to inspect robots, who gets to work with teams at the field all day on competition day, I can't see it. And so judges definitely aren't going to see it in that 5-minute presentation unless you call it out and unless you put it in your engineering portfolio. So that's the piece of advice I want to give in response to your question, even though I'm not really answering it.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the questions for me because I think our call time is also wrapping up. Do you guys have any other final questions?
No.
No.
Okay, thank you for taking in. Thank you for taking your time to be on the call today. Will we see you at the Space Coast Championship in a couple weeks? I know you.
I believe you will. I may be
Okay.
stopping by to help out with your live stream. So you'll see it online.
All right, sounds great. We'll be looking forward to seeing you there, and thank you for taking your time to join us on this call.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.